History books tell you the US and USSR were bitter rivals, but they often ignore the black American tankers who became legends in the eyes of Joseph Stalin. While these men faced brutal segregation at home, they were receiving the highest Soviet honors for their bravery on the Eastern Front. Why did the Soviet leader champion these specific soldiers when their own country wouldn't? Look closely at these rare medals. They aren't from Washington, but from Moscow. In the heat of World War II, a group of elite African-American tankers performed so exceptionally that Stalin himself insisted on honoring them. Today, we uncover the red side of valor and reveal the tactical brilliance that made these segregated units the most unexpected allies of the Soviet Union. War does not always begin with thunder. Sometimes it begins quietly, in forgotten training camps far from the spotlight of history. In 1942, while the world burned under the shadow of fascism, a group of American soldiers prepared for a battle that was larger than Europe's battlefields. They were the men of the 761st Tank Battalion, African-American soldiers training in a segregated army that doubted their capability before they had ever fired a shot in combat. These men drilled under watchful eyes that expected failure, endured hostility from their own countrymen, and lived within systems that denied them dignity. Yet beneath the surface, something else was forming. Discipline, technical skill, and a resolve sharpened by injustice. They were not just preparing to fight Nazi Germany. They were preparing to prove their worth in a nation that had yet to recognize it. Their training was long and punishing. Unlike many white tank units that moved into combat quickly, the 761st remained stateside for nearly 2 years, repeatedly evaluated, repeatedly delayed, repeatedly tested as if waiting for proof that might never be accepted. Tanks became their world's steel beasts that required precision, teamwork, and trust. Inside those armored vehicles, hierarchy dissolved into survival. Gunner, driver, loader. Each life depended on the others. By the time deployment orders finally came, they were ready not merely in technical skill, but in psychological endurance. They had learned patience, resilience, and how to exist under pressure. These qualities would define them in combat more than any weapon they carried. When they landed in Europe in late 1944 and were attached to General George Patton's Third Army, expectations were cautious at best. Patton, a hard and pragmatic commander, reportedly told them he did not care about their race, only whether they could fight. It was not praise, it was a challenge. And when they entered battle in November, the war wasted no time testing them. The battalion rolled into action across the muddy, scarred terrain of France, where artillery thundered and forests concealed deadly ambushes. Tanks advanced not with cinematic glory but with grinding tension, engines roaring, eyes scanning for muzzle flashes, nerves stretched tight enough to break. The 761st did not falter. They pressed forward into fortified towns and contested fields, fighting alongside units that had once questioned their presence. Days turned into weeks, and weeks stretched into months without relief. The battalion remained continuously engaged for 183 days, a span of frontline combat that few units experienced without rotation. Winter fell hard over Europe, freezing metal and flesh alike, and the Battle of the Bulge erupted into chaos. German counterattacks forced Allied forces into desperate defensive and offensive maneuvers. Through bitter cold and exhaustion, the 761st fought relentlessly. They broke through defensive lines, supported infantry advances, and absorbed losses that would have crushed less determined formations. Tanks were destroyed. Crews were wounded or killed. Yet the battalion kept moving. Their presence on the battlefield became less about proving themselves and more about survival and mission. The universal language of soldiers under fire. Their achievements were measured not in headlines, but in ground taken and lives changed. They helped breach the Siegfried Line, a complex web of German fortifications designed to halt Allied momentum. They liberated towns where civilians emerged from fear into fragile hope. They pushed across borders, through 6 nations, their tracks carving a path across a continent scarred by tyranny. Decorations for bravery accumulated: silver stars, bronze stars, purple hearts, tangible recognition of extraordinary action under extraordinary circumstances. Still, recognition did not erase contradiction. These decorated soldiers were simultaneously symbols of national heroism and subjects of institutional inequality. The paradox remained unavoidable. They fought for democracy abroad while denied full equality at home. As the war neared its end, their journey carried them deep into Central Europe. There, advancing eastward, they eventually encountered Soviet forces moving west, two armies, converging toward the same defeated enemy from opposite worlds. It was a meeting heavy with symbolism. On one side stood American soldiers from a segregated battalion. On the other, troops representing a state that proclaimed ideological equality yet operated under its own rigid structures of power. The convergence marked more than a tactical link-up. It represented the closing circle of global conflict and the uneasy alliances that shaped it. Whatever geopolitical curiosity surrounded such encounters, the battalion's focus remained grounded in immediate reality. The war was ending, and survival had carried them to its final chapters. When victory finally came, the men returned home, carrying memories carved in steel and fire. But triumph abroad did not translate into transformation at home. Segregation persisted. Opportunities remained limited. Parades and public gratitude often bypassed them. Their story slipped quietly into the margins of national memory, overshadowed by larger narratives of victory. Yet history does not remain silent forever. Over time, scholars, veterans, and communities brought their legacy back into view, revealing how their performance challenged racial assumptions within the military establishment and contributed to the broader momentum that eventually led to desegregation of the armed forces. Today, their legacy stands as both achievement and lesson. The 761st Tank Battalion's story is not simply about armored warfare or battlefield success. It is about endurance under layered struggle, confronting enemies abroad while carrying burdens at home. It reminds us that heroism often exists beyond celebration, sometimes hidden for decades before recognition arrives. That tanks may no longer roll across Europe, but the imprint they left on military history and social progress remains unmistakable. They were warriors shaped by contradiction, defined by resilience, and remembered not as ghosts of the Western Front, but as voices that history finally learned to hear. War is fought with artillery and armor, but it is also fought with perception. As the Second World War unfolded, governments learned that controlling narrative could shape the battlefield beyond physical borders. In Moscow, Soviet leadership monitored not only troop movements and industrial output, but also the social fractures within rival nations. Intelligence analysts and propagandists recognized something unmistakable about the United States. It was championing democracy abroad, while maintaining segregation and racial inequality at home. This contradiction was not merely moral, it was strategic. It presented an opportunity to undermine American credibility in the global ideological struggle that was already taking shape, even before the war ended. The Kremlin's information apparatus, which blended intelligence gathering with media messaging, paid close attention to how minority troops were treated within Allied armies. Reports circulated through diplomatic channels, journalists, and surveillance of foreign press coverage. Units like African American combat formations, including black tankers fighting effectively in Europe, provided material that could be reframed to challenge Western narratives of equality. Soviet strategists did not invent these realities. Rather, they highlighted them selectively, amplifying them to demonstrate that racial hierarchy existed inside a nation that presented itself as a model of liberty. This framing allowed Moscow to position itself as an ideological alternative, portraying socialist governance as morally superior in matters of race and class, regardless of its own internal contradictions. State-controlled media outlets amplified stories of black American soldiers' battlefield performance with careful emphasis. Coverage celebrated their bravery, discipline, and effectiveness in combat. But this recognition was rarely neutral admiration. Instead, praise functioned as contrast, an implicit critique of how those same soldiers were treated by their own government and society. High-profile mentions in Soviet press and messaging channels drew attention to their achievements precisely because those achievements disrupted American claims of racial harmony. This was messaging aimed not only at domestic audiences but at international observers, especially those living under colonial rule or within newly emerging independence movements. By spotlighting racial inequities in the West, Soviet communicators attempted to shift moral authority toward themselves. As the conflict progressed and transitioned toward postwar positioning, the tone of coverage evolved. What began as battlefield acknowledgement increasingly became strategic narrative construction. Soviet messaging extended beyond recounting military performance into broader ideological outreach, particularly targeting populations across Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean regions. where anti-colonial sentiment was rising. Stories of discrimination faced by Black American servicemen were woven into larger arguments suggesting that Western democracies were hypocritical and unreliable champions of freedom. This approach sought to resonate with global audiences experiencing their own struggles against racial or imperial domination, inviting them to question Western leadership and consider alignment with alternative political models. Yet this transformation from reporting to propaganda did not occur in isolation. It intersected with the early currents of what would later become the Cold War's information battles. Media campaigns became tools to influence opinion beyond borders, shaping identity and allegiance. African American soldiers' stories were not simply recounted as human experiences. They were curated into symbols within a geopolitical contest over legitimacy. The intention was not merely to criticize American policy, but to win hearts and minds across continents by presenting solidarity, rhetorical or otherwise, with marginalized populations. In hindsight, this moment illustrates the layered complexity of wartime storytelling. The courage and sacrifice of Black tankers were authentic and undeniable, grounded in lived experience and battlefield action. But the international attention their story received was also filtered through competing agendas. Their valor became part of larger narratives crafted by powerful states seeking advantage in ideological rivalry. It is a reminder that recognition on the global stage is rarely free from context or intention. Behind every celebrated story lies a network of motives, interpretations, and consequences that extend far beyond the individuals at its center. Ultimately, the Soviet spotlight on racial tension within the United States did not simply reflect compassion or solidarity. It reflected strategy. It demonstrated how human struggle could be reframed as geopolitical leverage, how heroism could be appropriated into messaging, and how the aftermath of war set the stage for contests of influence that would define decades to come. The legacy of that moment remains a case study in how narratives are weaponized, and how the truth of individuals' courage can coexist with the calculated uses others make of their stories.